What's the wildest thing you've heard because you happen to understand the language? Male story 1. I slouched in my seat, staring blankly out the window of the rattling train. Another humid day in Australia, the air thick and sticky even inside the carriage. The train was packed with students, mostly teenage girls in their uniforms, the kind of chatter you'd expect on a weekday afternoon. My headphones rested around my neck, music paused as I soaked in the mixed hum of conversations around me. Two guys sat a couple of rows back, close enough for me to catch snippets of their talk. French. I didn't pay much mind at first, but then their words slid in like a blade. The first few sentences sounded innocent enough, just mindless chatter. But then they shifted, their tone sharpening. I caught phrases here and there. Graphic, crude, downright repulsive. They weren't holding back, describing in stomach-churning detail what they'd like to do to the girls around them. It only took about half a minute before my blood started to boil. These weren't just off-color jokes, this was twisted. I glanced around the carriage. Most of the girls they were gawking at were underage, wearing those navy blue and white school uniforms. They had no idea what was being said about them. My pulse hammered in my ears as I listened, the words getting worse, turning darker with each passing second. I turned around, steady and cold, locking eyes with those two scumbags. I launched into a tirade, my French sharp and precise, each word hitting them like a slap. I didn't hold back. I tore into them, dragged their filth out into the open for everyone to hear. The other passengers fell silent, heads turning toward the commotion. The two men froze, eyes wide, mouths hanging open. They looked like deer caught in headlights, paralyzed by shock. I didn't stop there. I hammered home my point, switching to English for the final blow so everyone around us could understand exactly why I was dressing them down. Their faces turned a deep shade of red. They fumbled with their bags, faces glued to the doors, desperate for a way out that didn't exist. For the rest of the ride, they stayed silent, hunched forward, avoiding eye contact with everyone. I kept an eye on them until the train rolled into the next station. When they finally stepped off, the doors hissed shut behind them. The train lurched forward, the moment passing, leaving them standing there, stunned and small on the platform. Male story 2. It happened in Boston, of all places. I was there with my girlfriend, staying in a downtown hotel. One of those sleek, modern ones where everything is all glass and steel, the kind of place that makes you feel a bit out of place if you're not dressed in business casual. We'd just finished a long day of sightseeing, feet sore and stomachs grumbling, and decided to head back up to our room to relax for a bit. We stepped into the elevator, already half zoned out, and joined a middle-aged couple standing inside. The man wore a slightly strained expression, the kind you notice but don't really think much about. His wife seemed oblivious, scrolling through her phone. We settled into our corner as the elevator jerked upward, and that's when I heard him. He leaned toward his wife and muttered in Swiss German. Now, Swiss German isn't something you'd expect to hear outside of, well, Switzerland. But here he was, confiding in her that he had just let out a silent fart and hoped we wouldn't notice. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from bursting out laughing. I mean, the guy had no clue we could understand every word. The air in the elevator started to turn, slowly, like a creeping fog. The smell was undeniable, hitting us in the face like a rogue wave. My girlfriend's eyes went wide, and I could see the effort it took for her not to gag. We exchanged a quick glance, both of us straining to keep a straight face as the odor clung to the small, enclosed space. The couple stood there, blissfully unaware of our shared understanding. The guy just looked smug, like he'd pulled off some masterful trick. Finally, the elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. They stepped out, the man leading the way with an air of victory. Just before the doors closed, I turned to my girlfriend and blurted out in Swiss German, "Boa, it stinks in here, doesn't it?" The man whipped around, eyes wide, mouth falling open. For a split second, he looked like a deer caught in headlights, realizing too late that his secret hadn't been so secret after all. The doors shut on his expression, and we burst into laughter, doubling over as the elevator continued upward. Male story 3. I stood there, a bit bored, with the small transistor radio in my hand. The market was crowded, the sun cooking the asphalt, and I leaned against a lamppost, trying to catch any bit of shade. A familiar reporter's voice crackled through the static, speaking in English with that polished, distant tone they all use. Then, the sound of Spanish broke through quick, raw, full of the kind of anger that cuts through the noise of city life. My ears perked up. The reporter was in Caracas, right in the aftermath of the crash. You could hear the chaos in the background, car horns blaring, voices shouting over one another. She was asking a local man what life was like now. I adjusted the volume, catching every word. The man had a rough voice, deep with exhaustion, like he'd been carrying the weight of a collapsed country on his shoulders. He didn't sugarcoat it. No hesitation, no decorum, just brutal honesty. Estamos comiendo ratas y gaviotas, he said. We're eating rats and seagulls. My grip on the radio tightened. I knew enough Spanish to get the full picture. This wasn't some metaphor or exaggeration. He meant it plain and simple. Rats. Seagulls. The kind of thing that made you stop breathing for a second. I strained to hear the reporter's response. She paused, just a split second, then rattled off in her smooth, polished English. People are having a hard time finding 3 meals a day. My jaw almost dropped. She completely erased his reality, glossed over it like paint on a cracked wall. I could still hear his words ringing in my ears, the desperation in them. He was shouting into the void, and she had turned it into a vague soundbite. Like what he was going through didn't fit into the neat little narrative she had to deliver. The crowd around me continued its noisy shuffle. People haggled over fruits, honked at jaywalkers, cursed the blistering heat. Life went on as usual, while somewhere not so far away, people were chasing down seagulls just to get through the day. I turned the radio off. The market's cacophony filled the silence it left behind. I stuffed the radio back into my bag, feeling the day carry on, unchanged by the story no one had heard the way it was meant to be told. Male story 4. I remember this story like it was yesterday. I was dating this girl, Leah, for a few months. She was Jewish, born and raised in this tight-knit family with deep roots. Every week, like clockwork, they had this housekeeper come by to clean. The lady was Polish, probably in her late 40s, with a stern face that made small talk seem like an impossibility. She'd arrive early, set down her supplies, and get to work, muttering to herself in Polish as she moved from room to room. No one really paid much attention to her ramblings. One particular day, there was an electrician at the house. Some rewiring job that had him crouching in corners, tools scattered across the floor. The housekeeper was there too, scrubbing away in the kitchen, mumbling under her breath like always. Leah's parents were in and out, dealing with their own business, probably barely noticing either of them. The electrician worked quietly, but his eyes kept darting toward the housekeeper as she muttered. Something about his expression changed, a furrow forming between his brows. He didn't say anything while he worked, just moved with a deliberate slowness, like he was listening to something that didn't sit right. After an hour or so, he finished up, packed his tools, and approached Leah's parents. He seemed hesitant, glancing back toward the kitchen where the housekeeper was still scrubbing, her voice carrying softly in that rolling Polish cadence. Then he leaned in close and, almost apologetically, told them what he'd been hearing. "I speak Polish," he said, "and your housekeeper's been saying some pretty wild, nasty stuff. Anti-Semitic, actually." Leah's parents stood there, blinking as his words sunk in. They hadn't understood a word the woman had been saying all this time. She'd been in their house, working around them, and apparently spouting off all sorts of hateful nonsense in a language they couldn't catch. When the housekeeper left that day, they didn't say a word to her. They just picked up the phone, called the company that sent her, and made it clear she wasn't welcome back. A few days later, Leah told me the whole story. I could hardly believe it. This woman had spent months, maybe years, talking trash right under their noses, thinking no one would catch on. But one random electrician, in the right place at the right time, shut it down in an instant. Male story 5. It was a typical London morning on the Underground, packed with commuters crammed shoulder to shoulder. The air in the carriage felt heavy, a mix of stale coffee breath and wet raincoats. I stood near the door, gripping the metal pole, half listening to the hum of the train as it rattled along the tracks. The usual crowd, eyes glued to phones, faces blank, avoiding eye contact. That's the unspoken rule on the tube: don't interact. Then, right across from me, this couple caught my eye. Mid-30s, stylish in that casual, effortless French way. He wore a crisp coat, hair tousled just so, and she had that scarf tied perfectly around her neck. They looked every bit the visiting tourists. I didn't pay them much attention at first, just another pair among the sea of passengers, until the man shifted uncomfortably. He glanced around, clearly searching for something, then turned to his wife with this look of pure urgency. In French, and with absolutely no attempt to lower his voice, he announced, "Honey, I desperately need a shit." It came out loud, clear, and with a tone that mixed desperation with unfiltered honesty. I felt my eyes widen before I could stop myself. I wasn't the only one who heard heads turned, eyebrows shot up, but the thing was, most people probably didn't catch what he said. French can sound poetic, even when it's blunt. I understood every word, though, and it hit me like a punchline I wasn't expecting. I let out a snort, couldn't hold back. Laughter spilled out of me, echoing through the otherwise quiet carriage. The man froze, his face flushing as red as a stop signal, and turned toward me, mouth slightly open in surprise. His wife, however, doubled over with laughter. She grabbed onto his arm, shaking with each giggle, eyes glistening with delight. He shot me a sheepish look, somewhere between shock and mild horror, while his wife wiped tears from her eyes. The train rocked around a curve, but the laughter stuck, hanging in the air like a welcome break from the dreary commute. The moment stretched out until the train screeched to a halt at the next station. As they shuffled off, his wife still clutching her side from laughing so hard, he threw one last glance over his shoulder, cracking a reluctant grin.
Female story 6. There I was, standing mid-plane, holding the safety card like it was a prop in some tired theater play. My early 20s had me bouncing from city to city as a flight attendant, thinking I'd seen every flavor of rude there was. I raised my arms, pointing to the exits like a robot, doing the usual demo. That's when I caught their eyes, this couple sitting a few rows back, smirking like kids in the back of a classroom. They whispered to each other, shooting glances at me and my coworker. I kept my face blank, kept up the motions. But their voices cut through the engine hum. They were using the country's second language, rattling off insults about us, the airline, even the way we stood there. I felt the words land like jabs, each one laced with that casual cruelty people use when they think no one's listening. I finished the demo, snapped my arms down, and shot them a quick look. They just grinned, that kind of smug grin that digs under your skin. I walked back to the galley, letting them believe they'd gotten away with their little game. They chatted away, getting louder, getting bolder. A few of the other passengers glanced over, picking up bits and pieces of what was going on. I counted down in my head as we prepared for takeoff. The seatbelt sign dinged. The captain gave the usual spiel, and I moved back down the aisle. The couple locked eyes with me, still smirking, still playing their part. I leaned in, calm as ever, and spoke to them. Not in English, no. I used their language, the same one they'd just used to tear us apart. I told them to buckle up and get ready for takeoff. Their faces drained of color. The woman's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The man blinked, his eyes darting around like he was looking for an escape hatch that didn't exist. They fumbled with their seatbelts, nodding frantically, tripping over apologies and broken sentences. I watched them squirm, trying to turn on the sweetness like a switch. It was almost pitiful. The rest of the flight, they sat there, eyes glued to their trays. When I passed by with the drink cart, they managed a tight-lipped apology, eyes pleading for some sort of mercy. I poured them each a soda, nodded, and moved on.
Male story 7. My friend's parents had this wild encounter while road tripping through Canada. They'd rented a camper van, one of those boxy ones that rattles with every bump in the road, but perfect for the vast, open highways. They cruised around, no fixed plans, just taking it day by day. One morning, they pulled over at some nondescript breakfast spot on the side of the road. You know the type, big parking lot, a handful of trucks, and a faded sign swinging in the breeze. Inside, the place was just waking up. Coffee machines hissed, plates clattered, and the smell of bacon hung heavy in the air. They found a table by the window, ordered pancakes, eggs, the works. As they waited, they chatted in Frisian, their native tongue, casually running through plans for the day. Something about hitting up a lake nearby, then maybe a small hike. They didn't think twice about it, who would understand Frisian here, of all places. A man in his mid-60s shuffled past them toward the counter. Tall, slightly stooped, with a mop of gray hair sticking out under a worn baseball cap. He paused mid-step, froze like he'd seen a ghost. Then, slowly, he turned around, eyes wide, and approached their table. Without hesitation, he greeted them. In Frisian. The shock hit them both at once. Here, in the middle of some random Canadian breakfast joint, stood a stranger speaking their language. They stared for a split second, taking it all in. And then it clicked. They greeted him back, and soon, they found themselves in a whirlwind conversation. The man explained he had German roots, and his mother, a Frisian speaker, had taught him the language. She had passed away decades ago, and since then he hadn't heard a word of Frisian. He pulled up a chair without asking, settling into the kind of conversation that feels both surreal and deeply comforting. Stories flowed, punctuated by bursts of laughter and long, reflective pauses. The man's eyes glistened as he listened to the familiar cadence of Frisian. And then, out of nowhere, tears streamed down his cheeks. He didn't bother to wipe them away, just let them fall as he talked. They stayed like that for a while, the table cluttered with coffee cups and sticky syrup bottles, sharing stories in a language that had momentarily bridged continents and decades.
Female Story 8. I remember that day clear as glass. It was a blistering hot afternoon in the city. I had been roaming through an open-air market, soaking in the sights, sounds, and smells of all the food stalls lined up. That particular market was my favorite spot, bustling with a blend of tourists and locals. I had been picking up bits of Spanish over the years, never really fluent, but enough to catch a phrase here and there. I was decked out in a new outfit, head to toe. It wasn't anything outrageous, just a bright yellow sundress, a bit of a statement piece, and some chunky sandals. The heat begged for something breezy, so I figured I had nailed the look. Oh, or so I thought. Wandering past a table stacked with piles of fresh mangoes, I found myself standing next to two little old ladies. They looked like regulars, each with a woven bag slung over one shoulder, eyes sharp as hawks behind thin glasses. They glanced my way, just briefly, before leaning in close to each other. They spoke quietly, but I could catch bits of their conversation. My Spanish wasn't perfect, but I caught enough to piece it together. They were sizing me up, picking apart my outfit in hushed but rapid-fire Spanish. Too bright for her skin tone, one of them muttered, giving my dress a quick side eye. The other one nodded, shifting her gaze down to my feet. Those sandals, not for walking. She'll regret it, they both snickered, and I pretended to examine a basket of avocados, keeping my ears peeled. My heart didn't skip a beat. Instead, a part of me wanted to laugh. Here I was, thinking I was strutting through the market in style, but these sonoras were tearing me down bit by bit. They moved on to my hair next. Apparently the bun I had messily thrown up that morning screamed, didn't even try. The gossip didn't stop there. One of them leaned even closer and whispered something about my confidence in yellow. The other one gave a slight nod, lips twitching into a faint, almost approving smile, like I had unknowingly passed some kind of fashion courage test. They shook their heads, grabbed their bags, and shuffled away, their voices fading into the market's hum. I stood there for a moment, rooted in place, the smell of ripe fruit mingling with their judgment still lingering in the air.